When my daughter passed away, my son-in-law told me to leave and set my bags outside. What seemed final was actually the first step towards something far greater. The quiet of the street pressed around me as I stood there, unaware that this moment would mark a turning point. What unfolded next carried the power to reshape not only my life, but also the lives of everyone who believed they knew how the story would end. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from. What followed was not just about grief, but about betrayal, justice, and the strength that rises in a man when all dignity is stripped away. I remember standing there in the cold night air, the suitcase I had carried for decades sprawled on the pavement, my clothes scattered like fallen leaves. The man who had once sworn to love and protect my daughter glared at me as though I were an intruder in the very home I had bought with my own sweat. That was the home where I had raised her with stories at bedtime, where laughter once echoed through the halls. Now those walls were closed to me by the one who should have been family. His voice was sharp, filled with contempt, calling me useless and saying I no longer belonged. I felt a pain deeper than any wound, not just from losing my daughter, but from realizing that the man she had married saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to his greed. The neighbors peeked through their curtains, whispers carrying across the quiet street, while I stood holding what little I could gather. My heart was torn between mourning and humiliation. Yet even in that moment of despair, something inside me stirred. A quiet fire told me this would not be the end of my story. I had sacrificed too much, endured too long, and loved too deeply to let my daughter's memory be trampled by a man's arrogance. I thought of the promises I had made to her as a child. I had sworn to always protect her. Though she was no longer there to hold my hand, I felt her presence urging me not to bow my head. Still, in that first moment, as I stood outside with my belongings scattered around me, I was overwhelmed by grief. Memories of her life flashed before me. Her laughter as a little girl running through the garden. Her tears on the day she lost her mother. Her smile on her wedding day. The warmth of her embrace the last time she said goodbye. All of it filled my chest until I thought it might break me. Still, I stood silent, staring at the closed door. It was the door of the home I had built brick by brick, the home I had filled with sacrifices only to be cast aside like a stranger. Tears burned in my eyes, but I knew this story would not end here. While he thought he had defeated me, while he thought throwing me into the street was his triumph, he had no idea of the truth. I was not just a grieving old man. I was the rightful owner of the life he was trying to claim. The same patience that had built my fortune, the same strength that had raised my daughter alone, would now be turned toward justice. I would rise from that humiliation. When I returned, I would return not as a victim, but as the man who reclaimed his house, his pride, and his daughter's memory. The day my daughter passed away will forever remain etched in my heart, not as a single moment, but as 1,000 fragments of grief that cut into me with every breath. I remember waking that morning with a heaviness in my chest, a dread I could not explain. By evening the phone call came, the one that shattered my world. Her voice would never call me father again. I sat there stunned, unable to move, my body heavy as stone, the receiver still pressed to my ear, though the line had long gone silent. When I finally stood, the house felt colder than I had ever known. Every corner carried her memory. The smell of the meals we once shared, the laughter that had once filled these walls, and even the shadows seemed to whisper her name. I thought of her childhood, how I had raised her alone after her mother passed, pouring into her all the love I had left to give. Now she was gone, and I felt as though both halves of my soul had been stolen from me. On the day of her funeral, I stood beside her casket with hands that trembled. My heart, breaking into pieces, I knew could never be put back together. The relatives gathered, their voices soft, and their eyes filled with pity, but none of it could ease the hollow ache inside me. I watched as they lowered her into the ground, the earth swallowing her gently as though even the soil knew it was receiving something precious. My son-in-law stood nearby, his face dry, his eyes avoiding mine, and I told myself it was his way of handling grief. I believed family would stand together in loss. I believed he would at least honor the love she had carried for both of us. In those first days I tried to console myself with memories, recalling her laughter in the garden, her voice calling out to me, her joy on Christmas mornings when she tore open gifts with childlike excitement. But every memory was bittersweet, for with each one came the sharp reminder that I would never see her smile again. Nights became unbearable. I sat by the window staring at the moon, whispering her name, praying she could hear me wherever she was. Sometimes I thought I could feel her presence, a warmth brushing against my shoulder, a whisper in my ear telling me to be strong. I clung to those moments because they were all I had left. People say time heals, but in those first weeks time only deepened the wound. I found myself wandering through her belongings, touching her clothes, opening old notebooks where her handwriting still danced across the pages. Each item was a reminder of her existence, proof that she had once been the center of my world. And yet now, without her, I felt as though the ground beneath me had disappeared. I held on to the belief that family would carry me through, that my son-in-law would grieve beside me, that together we would honor her memory. But even then, I sensed something shifting. His eyes carried no warmth. His voice held no compassion. Still, I clung to hope, because that is what fathers do when there is nothing else left. They hope, they endure. They pray their love has not been in vain. And so in those days of loss, as my heart bled for the only child I had left in this world, I told myself that grief would bind us together. What I did not know was that grief would instead reveal the cruelty that had been hiding in silence all along. In the days that followed my daughter's passing, I expected her husband to grieve with me, to sit in silence at the kitchen table and share the burden of loss. But almost immediately I began to notice a change in him, a chill that had nothing to do with sorrow but with contempt. At first it was small, just a sharp tone in his voice when I asked simple questions, or the way he avoided looking at me when I spoke, but soon his words grew harsher, spoken without care for the fact that I was mourning the same woman he had once promised to love. One evening I tried to ask him about arranging a memorial, something to honor her memory, and instead of compassion I was met with a scoff. He told me coldly that I should not interfere, that it was his responsibility now, his wife, his decisions. His tone cut me deeply, and I sat in silence as he brushed past me, muttering about expenses and arrangements as though love could be measured in receipts. I tried to remind myself that grief makes people strange, that perhaps this was his way of coping. But the more I listened, the more I realized it was not grief speaking, it was something darker. He no longer addressed me with the respect a son-in-law should give. He spoke to me as though I were a nuisance in his home. I noticed how he moved about the rooms with a possessiveness that unsettled me, glancing at the furniture, the paintings, the photographs, as though he were taking inventory rather than remembering the life built within those walls. Each day his words grew colder, his stares sharper, and I began to feel less like family and more like an unwanted guest. One night, I tried to speak to him gently, to tell him I missed her so dearly. Eyeing he might soften, but he looked at me with eyes empty of compassion and said that life goes on, that crying would not bring her back, His bluntness pierced me. I wanted to scream at him, to ask how he could be so callous. But I held my tongue, thinking of my daughter, remembering how much she loved him despite his flaws. I thought perhaps I owed it to her memory to be patient, but inside me sorrow twisted into unease. I knew then that the man she had trusted was not the man standing before me. The kindness he once showed me when they married had been replaced with bitterness and calculation. I saw it in the way he carried himself, as though he had already decided that I no longer mattered, and every word that left his lips confirmed it. In those days after her death, the warmth of family I had hoped to lean on turned into a cold wall that pressed against me, suffocating me. And though I tried to ignore it, I could feel the truth settling in my bones. My daughter's passing had not only taken her from me, it had taken the last thread of decency in him, leaving behind only contempt for the father who had given everything for her happiness. As I sat in that house after my daughter's passing and felt the coldness of my son-in-law's words seep into my bones, my mind could not help but drift back to all the sacrifices that had brought us here. And each memory rose before me, as if to remind me of the life I had lived for her sake. I remembered the long nights when she was young, and the world seemed too heavy for me to carry. How I would work double shifts at the factory, and then come home my hands blistered and my body aching, only to sit by her bed and tell her stories until her eyelids grew heavy. I remembered selling the few keepsakes of my youth, a watch that had belonged to my father, a ring that had been my mother's, just so I could pay her tuition and keep her future bright. I remembered the years when her friends all had new clothes while we could barely afford rent, and how I went without meals so that she would never know what it felt like to go hungry. I remembered the joy on her wedding day, the way her eyes shone with love as she looked at the man she had chosen, and the pride I felt walking her down the aisle, even though it was I who had paid for the dress, the flowers, and most of the reception. I never begrudged it, because I wanted her to have the kind of day she deserved. I remembered the house we stood in, the very walls that now seemed to reject me, how I had signed the deed with trembling hands after years of saving, knowing it would give her stability and comfort. I gave it to them freely, not as a gift to boast of, but as a father's offering to the daughter he adored. I remembered the countless birthdays when I wrapped small gifts in paper I could barely afford, just to see her face light up in gratitude. I remembered the nights when she cried after losing her mother, and how I promised her I would never let her feel alone, even if it meant breaking myself to keep her whole. Every moment of sacrifice was carved into me, not with regret but with love, because for her I would have done anything, and I did. Yet now, sitting in the house I had built and bought, treated as if I were a stranger, I felt the cruel weight of how easily all those sacrifices had been forgotten. My son-in-law did not see the man who had carried her through life. He saw only an old man in his way. He had not been there when I stitched her dresses late at night, or when I went hungry so she could eat, or when I mortgaged my future to buy this home for her comfort. He had not seen the sleepless nights, the weary mornings, the silent prayers, yet he enjoyed the fruits of them all. And now he dared to act as though none of it mattered. I closed my eyes and let the memories flow because they were mine. My proof that love had been given and sacrifices made, and though they stung now, they also reminded me of who I was, not useless, not broken, but a father who had lived his life in devotion, and no insult or act of cruelty could take that truth away from me. It did not take long after my daughter's funeral for the first signs of change to reveal themselves, and though they seemed small at first, I felt their weight grow heavier with every passing day. I would sit quietly in the living room, staring at the photographs of her on the walls, while her husband moved around the house with a restless energy. He began shifting furniture as though he were rearranging the space to his own liking, pulling down curtains my daughter had chosen, replacing frames with new ones that lacked any trace of her smile. I noticed how he stopped referring to it as our home or even her home. Instead, he began speaking of it as his. Subtle at first, word muttered under his breath when guests came by, telling them how fortunate he was to have such a place. His tone carried no gratitude, no mention of me, only pride as if he had built it with his own hands. I kept quiet, telling myself grief makes people cling to possessions, but the unease inside me deepened when he started moving my things. Boxes I had kept in the attic suddenly appeared by the door, and when I asked him why, he said coldly that he was making space. Space for what? I asked. Though I already knew the answer, he avoided my eyes, muttering something about needing the house to feel like his now, and I felt a pang in my chest, a warning that the love once tied to this home was unraveling. At meals he would sit across from me, his eyes hard, speaking less to me and more about me as if I were not there. I remember one evening when relatives visited, and he casually told them that the house had been left to him. His voice calm, but laced with possession. My stomach tightened at the lie, but I held my tongue, unwilling to shame him in front of others. Yet the words stayed with me, echoing in my mind, planting a seed of fear that would soon grow into reality. I could see it in the way he walked through the halls, his chest puffed, his steps heavy, as if each stride was a claim of ownership. He began locking doors I once opened freely. Cupboards I had stocked for years now suddenly closed to me. He even adjusted the seating at the table, pushing my chair further to the corner as though to make me smaller, less visible. Each sign was small enough to dismiss on its own, but together they painted a picture I could not ignore. He was not mourning my daughter. He was erasing her, reshaping the home she loved into a prize for himself, and in that reshaping I was being pushed out piece by piece. My place in the house shrinking with every word, every movement, every cold glance. And though I remained quiet, choosing to endure for the sake of her memory, I knew in my heart that these were not just signs, they were warnings of what was to come, warnings I would soon be forced to face in full. The day came when the signs of change turned into open declaration, and I remember it clearly because it was the first time my son-in-law looked me in the eye and spoke the words that stripped away any illusion of family. It happened one evening as I sat in the living room, holding a framed photograph of my daughter, my thumb brushing across her smiling face. He walked in with a sharpness in his step, his voice heavy with authority, and he told me directly that since his wife had passed, everything in this house was rightfully his. I froze at first, thinking I had misheard him, but the glare in his eyes told me he meant every word. I asked him softly what he meant, reminding him that I had bought this house long before he entered our lives, but he waved his hand dismissively, saying that marriage made it theirs, and with her gone, the house was his alone. I felt my heart twist in disbelief, the audacity of his claim crashing against the years of sacrifice that had gone into every brick of this home. I reminded him that I had worked day and night to afford it, that I had signed the deed, that I had given it freely to my daughter out of love, but he only smirked, telling me the past no longer mattered, that legally and practically it was his to control. His tone was not just cold but mocking, as though he enjoyed seeing me reduced to defending what was already mine. I looked at him carefully then, seeing not grief or sorrow for my daughter's passing, but hunger, a hunger for possession, for control, for erasing me entirely from the picture. The argument grew heated, my voice rising with desperation, while his remained steady, calm, and cruel. He spoke as though he were granting me charity by even allowing me to stay under his roof. I remember gripping the arm of my chair to steady myself, my chest tight, because never in my life had I imagined the man my daughter loved would turn on me with such arrogance. The photograph trembled in my hand as I tried to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. I told him he was dishonoring her memory by speaking that way, that she would never have wanted me cast aside, but he shrugged as if her wishes meant nothing now. His final words that night still echo in my ears. He told me that the sooner I accepted the house belonged to him, the easier it would be for both of us. I sat there in stunned silence as he walked out, leaving me clutching the photograph to my chest, and in that moment I felt a wound open inside me, deeper than the grief of losing her, because now I understood that he had not only taken my daughter from me through death, but he sought to take the last piece of her life that connected us. The home filled with her laughter, her touch, her spirit, and though anger boiled in my veins, I swallowed it, knowing the time would come when I would no longer remain silent. But for that night, I sat in the dim light of the room, staring at the door he had walked through, and I promised my daughter silently that I would not let him erase me, nor would I let him claim what was never his to begin with. The breaking point came on a night colder than most, when the weight of grief and betrayal finally pushed into cruelty I could not have imagined. I had been sitting in the living room quietly, the house unnaturally still, when he appeared with a look on his face that told me something was about to happen. Without a word, he began gathering my belongings, the small suitcase I had kept in the corner, the boxes of clothes I had folded neatly, even the old photographs I had tucked away. He tossed them carelessly to the floor, his movements sharp and unfeeling. I asked him what he was doing, my voice shaking, but he only smirked and told me it was time for me to leave. I stared at him in disbelief, the words catching in my throat, because this was not some distant relative's house. It was mine, the place I had bought and paid for, the place where my daughter had taken her first steps, where we had decorated the tree every Christmas, where laughter and tears had both lived, yet he treated me like a squatter in my own home. I pleaded with him, telling him this house held her spirit, that to be here was the only way I could feel close to her, but he ignored me, dragging the suitcase to the door and flinging it into the cold night air. I followed, begging him to stop, but with each bag he hurled out, my heart shattered further. He opened the front door wide, letting the winter wind rush in, and shoved the last of my things onto the street. His voice rose then, sharp and cutting, telling me that I was no longer welcome, that I was nothing but a burden, and with that he slammed the door in my face, the sound echoing through the night like a final verdict. I stood there frozen, my breath tight, turning to mist, staring at the closed door, my belongings scattered on the pavement like debris. Neighbors peeked through their windows, some stepping out onto their porches, their eyes wide with pity and gossip. I bent down slowly, my hands trembling as I gathered what little I could, the photographs bent and torn, my clothes damp from the frost, and I felt humiliation burn hotter than the cold that surrounded me. I was not just grieving the loss of my daughter anymore. I was grieving the loss of dignity, the betrayal of trust, the cruelty of a man who should have been family. I sank onto the curb, my suitcase by my side, and for a long moment I could not move, the tears that I had held back for so long finally spilling down my face. The street was quiet, except for the whisper of the wind. And in that stillness, I realized that I had been cast out not only of a house, but of a life I had built with love and sacrifice. Yet even as despair threatened to consume me, A small flame stirred inside, for humiliation can either break a man or forge him anew. And as I sat there with the weight of the night pressing on me, I told myself that though he had taken everything from me in that moment, he would not take the truth, and one day the truth would return to reclaim what was rightfully mine. Standing outside in the cold with my bags scattered across the pavement, I felt a sting that pierced deeper than the winter air, for betrayal has a way of cutting through flesh and bone and striking at the very soul. I had endured grief before, when I lost my wife. I had endured hardship when I was scarce, and every day was a struggle. But nothing compared to the feeling of being cast out of my own home by the man my daughter had once loved. I bent down to gather my belongings, my hands stiff with frost, each article of clothing a reminder of the life I had built within those walls. The neighbors who had stepped out whispered among themselves, some with pity, others with judgment, but none came to help. Their eyes only watched as though betrayal was some spectacle meant for quiet entertainment. My heart ached not just from the humiliation of standing there, but from the thought that my daughter would never have wanted this. I remembered her smile, the way she used to kiss my cheek before leaving the house, and I thought how horrified she would be to see her father abandoned in the night like a beggar. I felt anger rise, but it was drowned quickly by sorrow, because anger could not bring her back, could not erase the cruelty of the moment, could not fill the emptiness that spread inside me. I sat on the curb with the suitcase beside me, staring at the door that had once welcomed me home, now locked firmly against me, and the betrayal wrapped itself around me like a chain. I thought of every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every penny I had poured into that house. And now it had been stolen from me by deceit and arrogance. Tears stung my eyes, blurring the streetlights above. Yet, even in my sorrow, I felt the faint whisper of resolve, for betrayal may wound deeply, but it also awakens the truth, and I knew in that moment that I could not allow myself to fade quietly into the night. I would endure the sting. I would carry the pain, but I would not surrender, because surrender would mean letting him win not only over me but over the memory of my daughter, and that I could never allow. I rose slowly, my body stiff, and I picked up the suitcase again, the weight of it heavy in my hands, but heavier still was the promise I made to myself, a promise that one day justice would find its way into those walls, and that the betrayal I felt tonight would be the foundation of the reckoning to come. As I walked away from that house, carrying only the suitcase he had thrown at me, my heart heavy with grief and betrayal, my mind drifted back to the long years of fatherhood, the years that defined me, the years that made every sacrifice worth enduring. I remembered the night my wife passed away, leaving me alone with a little girl who looked up at me with tearful eyes, too young to understand death, but old enough to feel the emptiness it left behind. I held her close, promising her that I would always protect her, that she would never be alone, and in that moment my life became hers entirely. I remembered waking before dawn to prepare her breakfast before heading to work, rushing home late at night just to tuck her into bed, my body weary, yet my heart renewed every time she wrapped her tiny arms around my neck and whispered that she loved me. I remembered her first day of school, how she clutched my hand nervously, afraid to let go, and how I smiled through my own fear and told her she was brave. I remembered the school projects she brought home, the drawings of our small family, always with a big heart drawn between us. I remembered the scraped knees, the tears, and the nights I stayed awake by her bedside whenever she was sick, whispering prayers into the dark room, praying for her health, for her safety, for the strength to keep going. As she grew older, the challenges grew too, but so did my determination. I remembered how she dreamed of going to college, and how I worked every extra shift I could find, skipping meals, pawning the last of my possessions, doing whatever it took to see her dreams come alive. I remembered her graduation, the way her eyes scanned the crowd until they found mine, her smile wide and proud, and how she ran to me afterward, saying it was all because of me. I remembered her wedding, walking her down the aisle with tears in my eyes, the joy of seeing her so happy mixed with the quiet sorrow of letting go, yet I gave her freely, believing she had chosen a man who would love and protect her as fiercely as I had. I remembered the late-night calls she would make to me, sometimes about work, sometimes about worries, and sometimes just to say she loved me. Those calls were my lifeline, proof that the bond between us had never weakened. I remembered the way she always said she wanted me to stay close, to never feel alone, and how I promised her I never would. Every memory was carved into me like stone, unshakable, undeniable, a record of the life I had lived for her sake. And as I stood there with my suitcase in hand, cast out by the man she had married, I realized that no cruelty could ever erase those years. No insult, no betrayal, no locked door could take away the truth of fatherhood, for I had given everything, and in return I had been given her love, a love that even death could not silence. I closed my eyes then, letting the memories flow through me, letting them strengthen me, because, though I had been humiliated and betrayed, I was still her father. I was still the man who had raised her from the moment she took her first breath until the day she took her last. And that truth gave me the strength to keep walking, one heavy step after another, carrying not just my suitcase, but the unbreakable bond of fatherhood that no man could ever take from me. As I carried the weight of betrayal and the memories of fatherhood, I began to remember conversations with my daughter that I had pushed to the back of my mind, warnings she had given me before she passed, small confessions spoken in quiet moments when her guard was down. I recalled one evening when she came to visit, her smile gentle, but her eyes shadowed with something unspoken. We sat at the kitchen table sipping tea, and she leaned closer to me, as though afraid her husband might overhear, even though he was not there. She told me she sometimes worried about his obsession with money. She said he often spoke about inheritance and assets, things that should not matter when love is strong. Her voice trembled slightly as she admitted that his ambition frightened her. I reached across the table and held her hand, telling her not to burden herself with worry, that love would keep him grounded. Yet in my heart I felt unease even then. I remembered another time when she called me late at night, her voice low, almost whispering. She asked me if I thought her husband loved her for who she was or for what she represented. I tried to reassure her, saying that surely he loved her, because I could not bear the thought of my daughter doubting her own marriage. But her sigh lingered in my ear long after the call ended, heavy and uncertain. There was another moment, just weeks before she fell ill, when she came to the house and found me sitting on the porch. She lowered herself beside me, resting her head on my shoulder as she used to when she was little, and after a long silence, she sighed. She sometimes worried about what would happen if she was no longer there. Her words chilled me, and I brushed them aside quickly, telling her not to speak that way, but she persisted, her voice soft, saying that she feared he might not treat me kindly if she were gone. I laughed, then more to ease my own fear than because I found it funny. But she did not laugh. She looked at me, with eyes full of sorrow, and said, "Promise me, you will not let him take advantage of you." I hugged her close and promised without hesitation, though at the time I thought the promise would never be tested. Now those words echoed in my mind like prophecy, Each memory of her warnings cut through me, showing me that she had seen his greed long before I allowed myself to notice it. She had carried those fears quietly, perhaps too afraid to face them. And now she was gone, leaving me alone to live through the reality she had dreaded. I remembered her last days, how she looked at me with weak but knowing eyes, as if trying to tell me one last time to be careful, to be strong, to be ready. And now, as I stood outside the house I had once given her, cast into the cold by the very man she had warned me about, I realized her fears had been justified. She had known the hunger in his heart, the arrogance that would rise once she was no longer there to temper it. And though grief weighed on me, those warnings gave me strength, because I knew I could not allow her fears to become her legacy. I had to honor her by fighting back, by protecting what was mine, and by standing tall in the face of the man who thought he had broken me. Her voice lingered in my memory, not as sorrow now, but as resolve, urging me forward, reminding me that though she was gone, her love remained, and with it, the courage to face what was to come. That night, as I sat alone with only my suitcase at my side and the memory of my daughter's warnings echoing in my ears, something inside me shifted. The sorrow that had nearly crushed me began to harden into resolve, not the kind born of anger that burns out quickly, but a cold and steady determination that grows stronger the longer it is tested. I realized that I had spent too long living as though patience alone could protect me, that I had endured insult after insult in silence, but now I could no longer allow silence to be mistaken for weakness. I thought of my daughter's words, her fear that her husband's greed would one day turn against me, and I understood that if I did not act, her fear would become truth forever. I told myself that I had already survived more than most men could bear. I had survived the death of my wife, the lonely years of raising my daughter alone, the endless hours of work to provide her with everything she needed, and now I had survived the humiliation of being cast out of my own home. Yet in every one of those moments I had risen again, and I would rise once more. I looked at the house from a distance, its windows glowing faintly in the night, and I no longer saw it as a prison of grief. I saw it as a battleground, a place where my love had been poured into every brick, a place where justice must be reclaimed. I told myself that I would not fight with fists or with anger. I would fight with the truth, with patience, and with strategy. I would fight in a way that could not be denied or overturned. My resolve grew colder with each thought, penning me into something I had not felt in years. A man who would not bow, a man who would not beg, a man who would not allow arrogance to win over sacrifice. I felt my daughter's presence then, not as a soft comfort but as a guiding hand, as if she were whispering that I must be strong, that I must carry her memory with dignity, and that I must not falter. I clenched my fists slowly, feeling strength return to my body, and I made a silent vow that no matter how long it took, no matter how much effort it demanded, I would take back what was mine. I would reclaim my house, my dignity, and the memory of my daughter from the hands of the man who had dared to disgrace them. I rose to my feet, my legs stiff, but my spirit steady, and I walked into the night with a new purpose. The humiliation still stung, but now it served as fuel. The betrayal still cut deep, but now it gave me clarity. Every step I took carried the weight of resolve, and though I had no plan yet, I knew the first step was to find one. I would not rush. I would not stumble blindly. I would prepare, quietly and carefully, just as I had built my life before, and when the time came, I would strike with the truth, not with rage, but with the certainty of justice. As the cold air wrapped around me, I felt stronger than I had since the day I lost her. For now I knew I carried not just my grief but also my resolve, and that resolve would lead me to victory. The morning after I made my vow to reclaim what was mine, I began the quiet and steady work of turning resolve into action. I knew that rushing in with anger would only play into his hands, so I sought guidance from those who understood the power of law. I walked into the office of a lawyer I had once helped years ago when his family was struggling. He welcomed me warmly, though I could see the shock in his eyes when I explained what had happened. I laid out the story carefully: my daughter's death, the cruelty of my son-in-law, and most importantly, the truth of the house. How I had bought it with my own labor, how my name was etched on the deeds long before my daughter's marriage. He listened intently, nodding slowly. And then he began to ask for documents, receipts, records, anything that could prove my words. I pulled out the folder I had carried for years, papers yellowed with age but clear in their detail, the mortgage papers, the receipts of payments, the deeds signed by my hand. He studied them carefully and said that I had more than enough to assert my ownership, that my silence had given my son-in-law the illusion of power, but not the reality of it. His words steadied me, for I realized then that justice was not beyond my reach. I also consulted with a financial advisor who confirmed that the assets tied to the house were in my name alone. He told me that no court could deny the truth of those records. I left those meetings with a calm strength, knowing that I was no longer fighting alone. I had allies now, professionals who saw the truth and who would help me bring it to light. Yet I told no one else, not the relatives who had looked away, not the neighbors who had whispered behind their curtains, and certainly not the man who had thrown me into the night. I carried my plans in silence, every step calculated, every move deliberate, for I knew that the element of surprise would be my strongest weapon. He believed I was broken, cast aside, powerless. But with each passing day, I was gathering strength, gathering proof, gathering the tools that would expose his lies. I spent long nights organizing documents, piecing together timelines, preparing statements, and with every page I touched, I felt closer to justice. The professionals encouraged me to act swiftly, yet I told them I would wait until the moment was right, because this was not just about winning a case. It was about showing everyone the truth in a way that could never be denied. I wanted the man who mocked me to see that I had been patient, not because I was weak, but because I was wise, and when the time came, my wisdom would crush his arrogance, leaving him no ground to stand on. I left the offices each day with my head held higher, my steps firmer, my heart steadier, because for the first time since my daughter's passing, I felt the stirrings of hope, not only hope for myself but for her memory, for the promise I had made to her that I would never let him take advantage of me. I was keeping that promise now, with every document, with every meeting, with every plan, and though the road ahead was long, I knew I was walking it with purpose, guided by love, driven by justice, and armed with the truth. While my son-in-law strutted through the halls of the house as though he were king, I was quietly preparing in the shadows. Each day he grew bolder in his claims, speaking to friends about his inheritance and boasting about the life he would now live. And while he basked in arrogance, I was building a fortress of truth that would one day collapse on him. I spent long nights at my small rented room, sorting through old papers, every receipt, every letter, every record tied to the house, stacking them neatly into folders. I visited city offices to request certified copies of deeds. I combed through my bank records to trace every payment I had made for the mortgage. I gathered letters from neighbors who remembered me moving into the home long before my daughter's marriage, all of it quietly pieced together into an undeniable picture. I did not tell anyone of my work, not even the relatives who occasionally called to ask how I was managing. For I had learned that silence was my greatest ally. I let my son-in-law believe that I had surrendered, that he had broken me, that I was simply an old man left adrift. And in that belief he grew careless, his pride making him louder, his lies spilling out more freely, which only made it easier for me to gather witnesses. I documented every word I heard from those who told me of his boasting. I kept notes of his arrogance. I saved messages where he referred to the house as his alone, and with each note I felt the foundation of my case grow stronger. There were moments when I longed to confront him, to storm back into the house and remind him of whose name was on the deed. But I swallowed those impulses, for I knew timing mattered more than rage. I knew that if I struck too soon, he might find a way to cover his tracks. So I endured, day after day, letting him think I was gone, letting him think he had won, while in truth I was sharpening the blade of justice. I remember one evening walking past the house in silence, the windows lit with his laughter and the chatter of guests. I stood in the shadows of the trees, my chest tight, but instead of despair I felt resolve, for I knew the day would come when those same guests would learn the truth, when his laughter would falter, and when the home that he claimed as his own would be taken from his grasp. My preparation became a kind of ritual. Every night I would lay out the documents, read through them carefully, and then place them back into the folder, whispering to myself that my daughter's memory deserved justice, and that I was the only one who could deliver it. Each page became a weapon, each signature a shield, each witness a step toward reclaiming what was mine. Though I walked in silence, I walked with purpose, and though I carried the image of my humiliation like a scar, I also carried the knowledge that scars can become symbols of strength. In my quiet preparation I found peace, for I knew that patience would win where anger could not. And when the time came, no amount of arrogance, no loud boasting, no cruel laughter would be enough to save him from the truth that was waiting to strike. As I quietly prepared my case and gathered every document needed to reclaim what was mine, my son-in-law grew bolder with each passing day. His arrogance swelling like a balloon ready to burst, he began telling anyone who would listen that the house was his, that he had inherited everything, that the old man who once lived there was gone for good. I heard stories from neighbors who told me how he stood on the porch bragging about his new status, how he waved his hand proudly over the garden I had planted with my daughter, calling it his property. He invited friends over, giving them tours of the house, as though he had built it brick by brick, boasting about the furniture, the fixtures, the very photographs that still bore my daughter's smile. He even spoke of plans to renovate, saying he would tear down walls to make the space more fitting for his lifestyle. Each word carried to me by others cut deep, but I remained silent, for I knew every boast was another nail in his coffin. His arrogance blinded him to the truth that I was still watching, still listening, still preparing. He told relatives that I had gone weak, that I had left willingly, that I had no claim, and they repeated his words to me with looks of pity, not realizing that behind my quiet nods I carried the deed itself, the undeniable proof that his boasts were lies. I heard that he mocked me openly, calling me useless, saying I had nothing left, his laughter echoing through the neighborhood. But arrogance has a way of writing its own downfall, because the louder he bragged, the more witnesses I had, the more people who could testify to his false claims. I imagined him sitting at the head of the dining table where I once sat with my daughter, his chest puffed out, his voice loud, telling his guests that he was the master of the house. But I also imagined the moment when that voice would falter, when the papers I carried would silence his laughter, when his arrogance would crumble in front of the same people he tried to impress. The thought steadied me, gave me patience, and made every insult easier to bear. I did not need to shout back at him. I did not need to answer his lies, because the truth was waiting, and the truth needs no defense. The truth simply waits for its moment to rise. His arrogance became a cloak he wore everywhere, and though it made him appear powerful, I saw it for what it was, the desperate covering of a man who knew deep down he had nothing real. I carried myself differently, walking through town with quiet dignity, speaking little, but in my silence there was strength, the kind that unsettles the proud because they cannot understand it. While he spoke of power, I prepared for justice. While he bragged of ownership, I held the proof. And while he laughed at my silence, I sharpened it into the weapon that would destroy him. His arrogance was not just an annoyance, it was my greatest ally. For it gave me time, it gave me evidence, and it gave me the certainty that when the day came, his fall would be witnessed by everyone he had tried so hard to impress. The day came when my silence turned into action, and it was not with shouting or fists, but with the weight of law. I walked into the courthouse with the folder I had carried for months, every document carefully arranged, every signature proof of the truth I had endured in silence. My lawyer stood beside me, calm and confident, and together we filed the case, asserting my ownership of the house and exposing the lies my son-in-law had so proudly spread. As I handed over the papers to the clerk, my hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the gravity of the moment, for this was the strike I had been preparing for. The quiet culmination of nights spent gathering evidence and days spent enduring humiliation. I stepped outside into the cool air afterward, the courthouse steps beneath my feet feeling like the stones of a battlefield. I lifted my head and whispered to my daughter that I had done it, that I had kept my promise to her. While I had lived in silence and sorrow, she had warned me of this very day, and now I was standing against the greed she had feared. Within weeks, the legal notice was delivered to him, and the reaction was just as I had expected. Neighbors told me he had stormed around the yard, waving the papers in disbelief, shouting curses into the air, his arrogance crumbling as the weight of official seals and signatures bore down on him. He had believed his lies so thoroughly that he had no defense prepared. He had convinced himself the house was his simply because he declared it so. But now the law stood against him, undeniable and firm. I imagined him sitting at the same table where he had mocked me, staring at the notice with trembling hands, realizing that the man he had called weak had outmaneuvered him with patience and truth. For me, it was not just about property, it was about dignity, it was about reclaiming the love and memory tied to those walls. It was about honoring the sacrifices I had made and ensuring my daughter's warnings were not ignored. Filing that case was like lifting a weight off my chest, a weight I had carried since the night he threw me into the street. I no longer felt like a man cast aside. I felt like a man rising again. Every insult he had thrown at me now returned to him, not through my words, but through the very system he had underestimated. And though the battle was not yet over, the first strike had been made, and it was mine. The silence that once seemed like defeat had become my greatest strength, for while he had wasted his time, boasting and parading false power, I had prepared quietly, methodically, and now the truth was unfolding. I knew he would fight, I knew he would rage, but I also knew he could not erase the signatures, the deeds, the receipts, the undeniable proof that the house was mine. And as I walked home from the courthouse that day, the sun setting in the distance, I felt peace for the first time in months, because I had taken the step that turned grief into justice, humiliation into strength, and silence into victory. The confrontation came sooner than I expected, and though I had imagined it many times in my head, nothing compared to standing face to face with the man who had humiliated me. He arrived at my small, rented place one evening, with fury in his eyes, waving the legal notice in his hand like it was some kind of insult instead of truth. His voice was raised the moment he stepped through the gate, shouting that I had betrayed him, that I had no right to challenge him. I let him out while I stood calmly, my hands folded behind my back, because I knew there was nothing he could say that would change the ink on those papers. He demanded to know how I dared to drag him into court, how I dared to claim the house when his wife was gone, and in that moment I saw the greed laid bare. There was no sorrow in his voice, no grief for my daughter, only rage that his false inheritance was slipping away. I told him firmly that the house was mine, that it had always been mine, that my name was on the deed, signed and sealed long before he had even entered our lives. His face twisted at my words, his arrogance faltering as the truth pressed against him. He tried to argue, tried to twist the meaning of marriage, claiming that everything she had was his by right. But I held up the certified copies, showing him the signatures, the mortgage payments, the legal documents that carried more weight than any of his empty boasts. His hands trembled as he looked at them, and I could see the realization settle into him, that his game was ending, that his arrogance had been built on lies that could not stand against proof. He cursed me then, calling me every foul name he could summon, his voice echoing into the night. But the more he shouted, the calmer I became. For I had waited for this moment, I had carried humiliation in silence for months, and now I stood not as a victim but as a man reclaiming his dignity. I told him that the way he treated me after my daughter's death was unforgivable, that casting me into the street would be remembered, and that justice was now walking beside me. His anger boiled over. He lunged forward as though to snatch the papers from my hand, but I did not flinch. Instead, I met his glare with steady eyes and told him that the law was already in motion, that nothing he did could erase the truth. He backed away then, his chest heaving, his pride wounded in a way that shouting could not mend. I watched him falter for the first time, the mask of control slipping from his face. And I knew the confrontation had ended, not with violence, but with truth. He left in a storm of rage, slamming the gate so hard it rattled, but his footsteps carried no victory, only fear, for he knew the battle was no longer his to win. I stood in the quiet afterward, the night air cool against my face, and I whispered to my daughter that I had faced him, that I had not bowed, and that I would see this fight through to the end. The confrontation was over, but the war was nearly won. The moment I had prepared for finally arrived at a family gathering, and though my heart was heavy with the memory of my daughter, I carried myself with a calmness that had been forged in silence. The relatives were all there, seated around the long table, their voices filled with shallow laughter and polite conversation. My son-in-law sat at the head, his chest puffed out as though he were the master of everything, his tone loud, boasting again about how the house and all that came with it was his. I listened quietly for a time, my hands resting on the folder I had brought with me, letting him bask in his arrogance before the truth struck. When the moment grew still and the chatter died down, I rose slowly from my chair, all eyes turning to me with curiosity, some with indifference. I spoke clearly, my voice steady, telling them that I had remained silent for too long, that there were things they deserved to know. My son-in-law scoffed, mocking me openly, saying the old man had nothing left to offer. But I did not answer his insult. Instead, I laid the folder on the table, opening it with deliberate care, pulling out the deeds, the receipts, the certified copies that bore my name. The silence in the room deepened. As I spread the documents for all to see, I explained that the house he boasted of had been mine long before his marriage, that I had worked for decades to build it, to pay for it, and that my name was the only one etched in its foundation. I told them how I had supported my daughter and even her husband through generosity, giving them comfort without asking for recognition, and that in return I had been cast into the street, my belongings tossed like trash. The relatives leaned forward, their eyes scanning the pages, whispers rising among them as they realized the truth. My son-in-law's face grew pale, his smugness slipping as the weight of proof pressed against him. He tried to speak, tried to dismiss the documents, but his voice faltered, the laughter that once filled his throat gone. The in-laws stared at him with shock, their admiration for him replaced with disappointment and even anger. One cousin asked me softly why I had never spoken of this before, and I told them simply that I had believed family did not need remende, rs of sacrifice. That love was enough. But now the time for silence had ended. I lifted my head and said that respect cannot be built on lies, and that the truth would always rise no matter how long it is buried. The room was hushed, the power once claimed by him now gone, resting fully in my hands. I watched as the relatives turned their eyes toward me, not with pity but with respect, and I saw in their faces the shame of having believed his arrogance. My son-in-law sat frozen, his lips trembling, his arrogance shattered in front of everyone he had tried to impress. The public reveal was complete, and the truth had spoken louder than any boast could. I gathered the documents back into the folder, closing it firmly, and in that silence I felt a peace I had not known since the day I lost her, for I had reclaimed not only my dignity, but the memory of my daughter as well. After the documents had been laid bare before the family and his lies exposed, I watched my son-in-law's arrogance crumble piece by piece. The man who had once stood tall with his chest out and his voice loud now sat hunched at the table, his eyes darting nervously as if searching for some escape. He tried to speak again, to find words that might salvage his pride, but every attempt fell flat against the silence that surrounded him. The same relatives who once nodded at his boasts now turned away, their eyes heavy with disappointment, some even glaring at him with anger for having misled them. His in-laws sat rigid, their faces pale with shame, for they too had been deceived by his arrogance, and now they bore the embarrassment of having believed in him. He shifted in his seat, his hands trembling, and I could see that the foundation he had built his pride upon had been nothing more than sand, and now the tide of truth had washed it away. He slammed his fist once on the table, trying to regain control, but it only made him look more desperate. His voice cracked as he declared that the house was his by right of marriage. Yet the words rang hollow, for the documents in my hand told another story, the only story that mattered. The law was no longer on his side. The family was no longer on his side, and even his own pride had turned against him. I remained seated, calm and steady, watching him unravel, for I had no need to shout or gloat. His downfall was unfolding before everyone without my help. The humiliation that once belonged to me on the night he cast me into the street now sat squarely on his shoulders, and it weighed heavier than he could bear. The relatives began whispering among themselves, their sympathy flowing toward me now, their respect visible in the way they looked at me with lowered heads. One uncle spoke loudly, saying that I had been wronged and that justice was finally being seen. Another aunt muttered that my daughter would have been ashamed of her husband's behavior. Those words cut him deeper than any of mine could have. And I saw his face twist with rage, but rage could not cover shame. Shame had already settled into him like a permanent scar. His arrogance had blinded him to the truth, but now his blindness was gone, replaced by the harsh light of reality, and in that light he was small, smaller than he had ever been, no longer the master of the house, no longer the man who mocked me, just a broken figure clinging to pride that no longer existed. The decision was made quickly by those who had influence. The court had already sided with me. And now the family did too. He was ordered to leave the house, his possessions to be removed just as he had once removed mine. The irony was not lost on anyone, least of all me. And as he gathered his things in shame, his head bowed, I felt no joy, only a deep, quiet satisfaction. For justice had been served and arrogance had fallen. The man who had cast me into the street now stood cast out himself, his reputation shattered, his dignity gone, and his place in the family forever stained. The fall of arrogance was complete, witnessed by every eye that once admired him. And in that moment I knew that silence had won, patience had triumphed, and truth had claimed its rightful place. When the dust of the confrontation and the shame of his downfall finally settled, I walked once more through the front door of the house I had built with my own hands and sacrifices, and the feeling that washed over me was not triumph, but a deep, quiet relief. The walls seemed to breathe again as if welcoming me back. The photographs on the mantel caught the morning light, and I felt my daughter's presence more strongly than I had in months. I ran my hand along the wooden railing of the staircase, remembering the countless times I had carried her up when she was small and sleepy, her little arms wrapped around my neck. Every corner of the house spoke to me in whispers of memory. And as I moved from room to room, I felt the weight of belonging return. I had reclaimed not just a structure of wood and stone, but the heart of my life, the home that carried the laughter of my daughter, the warmth of family meals, the echoes of bedtime stories, and the scent of her favorite flowers in the garden. I walked into the kitchen, where I had prepared meals with her at my side, into the living room, where she once played the piano softly on quiet evenings, and into her bedroom, where I paused at the door, my chest tightening with both sorrow and peace. The space was still hers, the curtains she chose, the books she loved, the soft blanket folded at the end of the bed, and I stood there in silence, whispering that I had kept my promise, that I had fought back, that I had not let him erase her memory. Reclaiming the house was more than a victory over cruelty. It was a restoration of dignity. The moment I stepped back inside, I felt the chains of humiliation fall away. The night he threw me into the street no longer haunted me, because now the house was mine again, rightfully and lawfully, as it always had been. Neighbors who had once watched me gather my belongings in shame now greeted me with nods of respect, some with apologies, some with words of admiration, but I needed none of it. My satisfaction came from the simple act of standing once again in the place that held the essence of my daughter. I opened the windows wide, letting fresh air sweep through the rooms, as though cleansing away the arrogant sea that had polluted it for too long. I lit a candle in her memory, placing it by her photograph on the mantel, and I sat in my old chair, the one he had once tried to push aside, now restored to its rightful place, and I let the quiet fill me. The home reclaimed was not only walls and deeds, but a testament to endurance, a reminder that silence and patience, when paired with truth, can defeat arrogance. I did not shout of my victory. I did not boast to the family. I simply lived again within my home, carrying my daughter's memory in every step. And as I looked out the window at the garden, now mine once more, I promised myself I would care for it as she would have wanted. The roses she planted would bloom again under my hands, and every blossom would remind me that love cannot be erased. I reclaimed the house, yes, but more than that, I reclaimed the part of myself that had been wounded, the part that had been cast aside, the part that had nearly been broken, now healed by justice and memory. The home reclaimed was the life reclaimed, and I knew that from this day forward I would never again allow anyone to take it from me. As I sat once more in the quiet of my house, the place that had seen my daughter's first steps and her last breath, I found myself reflecting on everything that had come to pass, the grief of losing her, the betrayal of being cast into the street, the long nights of preparation, and the final return that restored not only my dignity, but the very memory I fought to protect. I thought of her warnings, those gentle words spoken in moments of doubt, when she admitted her fears about her husband's greed, and I realized how right she had been. She had seen in him what I had chosen to overlook, but her voice had not been lost. It had guided me, pushing me to rise. When humiliation tried to break me, I looked around the living room, the photographs still glowing in the light of the setting sun, and I felt her presence as though she were sitting beside me, her hand resting on mine, reminding me that love never dies. I whispered to her that I had kept my promise, that I had not let him take advantage of me, that I had defended what was ours. I told her that justice had been served, not with shouting or cruelty, but with patience, truth, and quiet strength. And I felt peace wash over me for the first time since she had gone. I thought, too, of the family who had once looked away, their silence heavy when I was humiliated, and how their eyes had turned back to me with respect when the truth was revealed. I did not hate them, for weakness is part of human nature. But I knew I would never forget who stood silent and who stood by, and that memory would live with me as surely as any victory. I remembered the look on my son-in-law's face when arrogance fell, when the law stripped him of every false claim, and I understood that his downfall was not my triumph, but the natural end of greed. He had mocked me, cast me out, humiliated me. Yet in the end, it was not my hands that destroyed him. It was his own pride, his own blindness, his own refusal to see the truth. I rose slowly from my chair, walked into the garden, and breathed in the scent of the roses she had once planted, the petals trembling gently in the breeze, and I realized that this was the final word, not anger, not bitterness, but peace. For peace is what she would have wanted. Peace is what she deserved, and peace is what I would carry forward. I knew that life would never be the same without her. The empty chair at the table, the silence of rooms that once echoed with her laughter. But I also knew that her memory would live on in every corner of this home, in every flower that bloomed, in every candle I lit in her honor. The cruelty of her husband could not erase her love. It could not erase the years we shared. It could not erase the truth of who I am and what I built. I am a father who kept his word, a man who endured, a man who chose dignity over despair, and that will be my legacy. I will live the rest of my days in this house, not as a victim, but as a guardian of her memory. And when my time comes, I will leave it not in the hands of greed, but in the hands of truth. The final word is this, that no matter how deep the betrayal, no matter how sharp the humiliation, love and integrity will always outlast arrogance. And as long as I draw breath in these walls, my daughter's memory will remain unbroken. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.